Donald Trump currently leads in the majority of battleground states, as well as the RCP average overall, albeit by less than he was leading Joe Biden when he was still in the race just a couple of weeks ago. But something that I think is overlooked is that Donald Trump has been increasing his polling numbers with a number of minority groups, including blacks, Hispanics, and Jewish voters, all of which could benefit him in the blue state of New York and potentially other blue states across the country. And that's going to be the topic of today's video. We're going to talk about why Donald Trump is very likely going to increase his margin in the state of New York. I'm not saying he's going to win New York. I don't really think that's possible in our current political dynamic. However, I do think Donald Trump could get close to that 40% number or even crack 40% in New York. And we're going to talk about why that is throughout this video. But of course, before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So for some reason, New York has been very competitive relative to where it has been polling over the past few cycles. If we take a look at the polling history in New York overall, these margins for Joe Biden were really abysmal for any Democrat. And they go all the way back to October of 2023, where you start seeing Joe Biden only leading Donald Trump here by single digits. Now, this was way before Joe Biden's debate performance disaster and his collapse in the polls. Joe Biden was still unpopular in the state of New York, but the polling in the state was surprisingly close. The polling remained very competitive all the way until Joe Biden dropped out. Now, even though Biden is out of the race, I still think Kamala Harris is going to be dragged down, in a sense, by Joe Biden's legacy. Even though she is a different candidate, she still is the vice president of the United States. I think there's still a lot Republicans can tie to her. But I think most of the trends that are going to lead to New York voting redder this time around than the previous two elections is the fact that the GOP has made inroads in these minority groups. Black voters, Hispanics, Jewish voters, all of which make up a sizable portion of New York's population. I mean, if we go back to 2020, New York was not remotely close. Joe Biden won the state 61-37. Now, interestingly enough, Donald Trump actually increased his overall percentage of the vote. He got 37.7% of the vote. That's the largest share of the vote in New York for a Republican since 2004 when George Bush cracked 40% here. Now, if we go back to 2016, Donald Trump only got 36.5% of the vote. Hillary Clinton was brought down to under 60%. Now, Donald Trump flipped a lot of counties in upstate New York from blue to red. And contrary to what most people think about New York politically, upstate New York really isn't that Republican leaning. I mean, if you were to take the city of New York out, I think either upstate New York votes narrowly Republican or narrowly Democratic. But it's really not a red state without New York City. It's more of a purple Rust Belt state, sort of in line with where Pennsylvania is, for example. But Donald Trump was able to flip a lot of these counties bordering Vermont from blue to red. And in 2020, he lost some of those counties, but was still able to retain places like Washington County, Warren County, Franklin, St. Lawrence, and these other counties sort of in the northern and eastern portions of the state. But I think Donald Trump's biggest potential for gains would be in downstate New York, places like Suffolk County, Nassau County, and of course New York City, because these are the areas where Republicans have been increasing their vote share by a considerable amount since 2020. I mean, if we go to the 2022 governor's race, and again, I don't always like to use this as an example of New York trending more Republican, but I think in this particular instance, it's very relevant because the biggest shifts to the right occurred in downstate New York. And that's why you saw the margins for Democrats in the midterms get a lot smaller than what they had previously been. And this didn't only affect Kathy Hochul, who was at the top of the ticket. It also dragged down Chuck Schumer, who only got 56.8% of the vote. That's a tiny portion of the vote and his closest margin of victory in the state of New York since 1998 when he was first elected. So this had down ballot consequences. Joe Pinion was really a nobody candidate, and he almost got 43% of the vote. He was able to win counties that Joe Biden had won back in the 2020 election, places like Essex County, for example, which in 2020 had went blue, Clinton County, so on and so forth. So these Republicans were able to overperform because you had a weak Democrat at the top of the ticket. Now, I'm not saying Kamala Harris is as weak of a candidate as Kathy Hochul, but like I said, these gains with various voting groups doesn't really show any signs of slowing down, and especially with the whole Israel-Palestine conflict in the Middle East, could potentially see Jewish voters vote the most Republican they have in decades. And I think that's something that some early preliminary polls have sort of shown to be true, as more of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party has been moving away from Israel and more towards Palestine, and this has alienated a certain segment of the Jewish voting population. Now, if we take a look at Hispanic voters, this is another demographic where Donald Trump has been doing a lot better, especially rural Hispanics in the Southwest. This apparently is just Hispanics overall. Donald Trump only loses Hispanics by 7 points, which for a Democrat, Kamala Harris only getting 51% of the Hispanic vote is absolutely disastrous. And that's going to have real consequences in areas where Hispanics make up a huge plurality of the population. Places like the Bronx, Brooklyn, areas where they are a large segment of the population. Now, I'm just talking about the state of New York specifically, but this could also be applied to places like Texas, Arizona, California, states with a large Latino population. And this has really been something that has been going on since the 2016 election. Latino voters moving ever more slowly towards the Republicans. And I think in 2024, you're probably going to see a really good performance for Donald Trump among this demographic. I think the real question is, does Donald Trump win white working class voters by the margins he needs in order to win the Rust Belt states that would get him to 270? I think that's really the ultimate question, because I think there's no doubt that Donald Trump is probably going to improve in places like New York, California, for the reasons I just mentioned. I mean, if we take a look at these shifts in New York from 2016 to 2020, the reason why Donald Trump actually did better in terms of his overall percentage of the vote was because he saw pretty massive shifts in places like the Bronx. Even Manhattan shifted a little bit to the right. You had, of course, Queens, Brooklyn, all the boroughs of the city, and even Rockland County shifting towards the right. And honestly, Rockland County, given what I was talking about earlier with Israel-Palestine, I could see Rockland County voting Republican in 2024, both in the presidential level and also the congressional level with Mike Lawler, just because you do have a really large conservative Jewish population here, which, if mobilized, would certainly be able to flip the county red like it did back in the 2022 election for governor, where Lee Zeldin won the county by 12 points. Chuck Schumer was able to win the county incredibly narrowly, and that was mainly because you had a bunch of rabbis here joint endorse Chuck Schumer and Lee Zeldin for both their races, and as a result, a lot of voters split ticket accordingly. I mean, Lee Zeldin got 61,000 votes out of Rockland County. Joe Pinion got 51,000. So you had nearly 10,000 voters choose Chuck Schumer and also Lee Zeldin. So this voting group certainly has significant influence, especially in downstate New York, and I think if these voters get behind Donald Trump publicly, you are going to see shifts towards the right in places like Rockland County. But even on Long Island, you saw a massive shift towards the right. I mean, Lee Zeldin was from Long Island, but a lot of the same issues impact Long Islanders, and it's really one of the only metropolitan areas in the country that's actually trending towards the right. Suffolk County, New York is the largest county, I think, in the entire country that Donald Trump actually won in the 2020 election. You know, back in 2016, I believe it was Tarrant County, Texas, but that flipped very narrowly blue. So Suffolk County is the largest county in the country that Donald Trump had won, and I really think he's probably going to win this county again. Now, in 2016, it voted for Donald Trump by nearly 7 points. This was the first time since 1992 a Republican won Suffolk County, and of course, fast forward to 2022, just 2 years later, Lee Zeldin wins here by 16 points. In neighboring Nassau County, which is also a suburban county outside New York City, Lee Zeldin won this county by 10. In 2016, Hillary Clinton only won this county by around 6 points. And in 2020, Hillary Clinton won this county by less than 10. Donald Trump won Suffolk County by around a handful of votes. So I think both of these counties are probably going to trend more Republican this time around. Again, for the reasons I mentioned earlier in the video. Nassau County is definitely a lot more Democratic friendly, so I don't really see this county flipping from blue to red, but I certainly could see Kamala Harris only winning here by maybe 6 or 7 points as opposed to 9 or 10. And as for Suffolk County, I could see Donald Trump winning here by anywhere from 6, 8, and maybe even 10 points on the high end, because on the federal and local level, Suffolk County has continued to trend more and more Republican. And in the local elections in Suffolk County in 2021 and 2023, countywide Republicans were winning here by double digits. So it's not just a federal election or a turnout issue. It seems like all across the board, the county is just much more Republican than it had previously been. So overall, I think Donald Trump probably could potentially get 40% of the vote in New York, again, if he wins Suffolk County and Nassau by the margins I mentioned, as well as making more inroads in the city. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised at this point in time if Kamala Harris gets less than 70% of the vote in Queens, and that's certainly going to have massive ramifications across the state because these are the most populous parts of the state. Even if Donald Trump improves massively in rural upstate New York, if these margins are left the same, he's probably only going to get 38 or 39% of the vote overall. So if you do see these big shifts downstate, as well as some shifts in rural upstate New York, you're probably going to see Donald Trump get around 40% of the vote, which would be massive for the down ballot ramifications because you have a number of competitive House seats in New York that could retain Republican control because of the fact that Kamala Harris is doing so weak at the top of the ticket. Now, obviously, there's still a few more months to go, but I think that certainly if current trends continue and Kamala Harris is only polling ahead in New York by low double digits, high single digits, then you could really see Donald Trump capture 40% of the vote here in the state of New York, and potentially Republicans hold on to all of the congressional districts that they had won the last time around. Even New York's 22nd, which has now been drawn in a much bluer district. It's an area that typically has a large split ticket voting base. Places like Onondaga County, which Joe Biden won by 20 points, routinely gets carried by Republicans narrowly in down ballot races. So you have all those factors at play. And again, this is going to have ramifications in swing states as well. If Donald Trump is doing well with these other voting groups in New York, he's probably going to do well with them in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, California, Texas, so on and so forth. And I know every state is sort of a microcosm, but I think that when you have a state as liberal as New York, as populated as New York, going more towards the right, I think that is an alarm bell for Democrats all across the country that they really shouldn't take their voters for granted, because New York has been one of the most loyal Democratic states. No Republican has won statewide in New York since 2002. And obviously, I think that trend's going to continue at least for 2024, but this potentially leaves the door open in 2026 for a very strong Republican, potentially to defeat Kathy Hochul for her re-election bid that year if she chooses to run. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.